I've always thought there was something magical about living out here, tucked away at the edge of the valley where the land stretches into a wide carpet of trees, rolling hills, an open sky so blue it looks like they were painted with the brightest brush in the box. When I first moved into my cabin, it felt like I had stumbled into a piece of quiet heaven, the kind of place you only see on postcards. My home isn't fancy by any means, just a solid wooden cabin with a big porch that creaks a little when you step on it, but to me, it's perfect. Out front, there are towering oaks and pines that have stood longer than most of the houses in the area. Their roots deep, their branches spreading out like arms that shade the land with a cool green curtain in the summer. Every morning, when the sunlight breaks through the treetops and the birds start their chorus, I take a deep breath of the fresh air and think about how lucky I am to live here. It's quiet, it's peaceful, and best of all, it's mine, or so I thought. You see, when I moved here, I knew about the Homeowners Association, or the HOA as everyone calls it, but I didn't think much of it. I figured it was one of those groups that sent out newsletters and kept the neighborhood entrance sign looking clean. You know, the kind of thing that mattered to some people, but not really to me. After all, my cabin sits near the edge of the neighborhood, more in the trees than in the manicured rows of houses, so I assumed they'd leave me alone. What I didn't account for was just how much power some folks think the HOA gives them, and how far they'll go to flex it. At first it was small things. I'd see a notice about someone's grass being a half-inch too long, or a car parked on the street overnight when the rules said it shouldn't be. None of it involved me, so I stayed out of it, though I'd shake my head sometimes, wondering who really cared about stuff that petty. But as I'd come to learn, there are always people who care too much, and they're usually the loudest ones in the room. In our neighborhood, that person was Karen. I didn't know her at first. I'd see her sometimes walking briskly around the cul-de-sac, her clipboard tucked under her arm like she was running for office, her face pinched up in that permanent frown that made it look like she'd smelled something sour. She wore those bright-colored suits, reds and pinks and greens, even in the middle of the day when everyone else was in jeans or shorts, and she carried herself like she was the sheriff of the neighborhood. People whispered about her at block parties, the way she once reported a kid for selling lemonade without a permit, or how she scolded a teenager for parking his truck 2 inches too close to the sidewalk. Most folks didn't want to mess with her, so they just nodded, smiled, and did their best to avoid drawing her attention. I did too, until the day she decided to set her sights on me. But before I tell you how that happened, you need to understand just how important those trees around my cabin are to me. They're not just decoration. They're part of the reason I moved out here in the first place. I grew up loving the outdoors, spending weekends hiking, camping, learning the names of plants and animals, and feeling a kind of peace I never found anywhere else. Those trees are like old friends, each one with a story to tell, each one holding up its piece of the sky. I'd sit on my porch at night, watching the wind sway through the leaves, listening to the owls calling, and I felt grounded, like I belonged here. Cutting them down, that wasn't even something I could imagine. Still, back then, I didn't think anyone would ever ask me to. My place was neat, the trees were healthy, and they weren't bothering anybody. The idea that they could become the center of a fight with the HOA felt impossible. But then again, when Karen is involved, impossible doesn't mean much. The first time I ever spoke to her, she came striding up my driveway without even knocking. Clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched on her nose, and a look that told me she wasn't here for small talk. "These trees," she said, waving her pen around like a conductor. "They're much too tall, much too close to the road. They're a hazard." I blinked, more surprised by her tone than by the words. I tried to tell her they'd been here for decades, maybe longer, and that they were perfectly healthy, but she cut me off with a scoff. "The HOA has rules," she said, tapping her clipboard. "And rules are rules." Then she turned on her heel and marched back down the driveway, leaving me standing there wondering what on earth had just happened. I laughed it off at the time, figuring it was just a weird encounter, maybe even a misunderstanding. But in the pit of my stomach, I felt something shift, like a storm cloud creeping over the horizon. You know when you can sense trouble before it fully arrives? That was me, standing there under the shade of those trees, watching her retreating figure and thinking that quiet doesn't always last forever. And as it turned out, I was right, because that encounter was just the beginning. What came next was the letter, the one taped to my front door with official-looking HOA letterhead, telling me in no uncertain terms that I was to cut down or severely trim my trees within 30 days or face fines. I remember standing there, reading it over twice just to make sure I wasn't imagining things, the bold words jumping off the page like a threat. My heart sank, then boiled with anger because it wasn't just about the trees. It was about someone trying to push me around in my own home, about someone thinking their clipboard gave them more authority than common sense. And while I hadn't said it out loud yet, in that moment I made myself a promise. I wasn't going to let anyone bully me into cutting down what I loved. I folded the letter, tucked it into my pocket, and looked up at the trees swaying gently in the breeze as if they were nodding in agreement. Little did Karen know, she had picked the wrong man to fight with, and those trees had a protector she could never have imagined. The day after I found that letter stuck to my front door, I told myself maybe it was just an automated notice, some generic message they send out to anyone who doesn't meet a checklist. But then another one came in the mail, this time with my name printed in bold at the top, and the words "Final Warning" written across the page like some kind of red flag. That's when it really hit me. This wasn't just a mistake, this was personal, and it had Karen's fingerprints all over it. I remember standing at the mailbox, the sun glaring down on the glossy HOA letterhead, neighbors strolling by with polite smiles, and me feeling like I had just been singled out in front of everyone. Inside the envelope was a list of violations that sounded almost laughable. Tree branches extending into community airspace, unsightly growth obstructing uniform appearance, and potential hazards from falling limbs. I couldn't help but chuckle, because if those trees were hazards, then so were every single oak and pine in the entire valley. It was ridiculous, but the tone of the letter wasn't funny at all. It was sharp, threatening, with phrases like non-compliance will result in fines and further action will be pursued. They weren't just asking me politely to trim a branch. They were demanding I cut down the very trees that gave my home its soul. That evening, as I sat on the porch with the letter in my hand, Karen showed up again, as if she'd been waiting for the right moment to make her entrance. She marched up the driveway in her bright green suit this time, clipboard hugged against her chest, lips pursed like she had already won. "I see you got the notice," she said, tilting her chin up like a schoolteacher scolding a lazy student. I told her I had, and that I thought it was absurd. Her eyebrows shot up, like she couldn't believe I had the nerve to question her. "Absurd?" she repeated, her voice dripping with fake concern. "These trees are a danger. What if a storm comes and a branch falls on someone's car? What if it blocks the road? The HOA is responsible for the safety of this community, and rules are rules," I tried explaining, as calmly as I could, that the trees were perfectly healthy, that I inspected them myself, and that they posed no danger to anyone. She didn't want to hear it. "This isn't up for debate," she snapped. "Either you comply or the HOA will handle it. And trust me, you don't want us to handle it." With that, she turned on her heel and strutted back down the driveway, her clipboard clutched like a weapon. I sat there stunned, not because I believed her threats, but because of how quickly she had escalated things. This wasn't about safety. This was about control. Over the next week, the pressure mounted. I got 2 more letters, each one harsher than the last. The fines started stacking up on paper. $50 for the first week of non-compliance, $100 for the next, and the promise that it would double again if I didn't act soon. It felt like they were trying to choke me into submission, drown me in paperwork until I caved. Neighbors began to notice. Some gave me sympathetic looks as they walked past, whispering things like, "Sorry you have to deal with her," while others avoided me altogether, afraid that even being seen near me would put them in Karen's crosshairs. At the grocery store, I overheard 2 people from the neighborhood talking about how the guy with the cabin was in trouble with the HOA, as if I were some cautionary tale. That's when I realized this wasn't just a private dispute anymore. It was becoming a spectacle. One night, I came home to find a bright orange notice taped to my door, bigger and bolder than the others. This one declared in capital, "Letters that immediate action is required." I stood there staring at it in the glow of my porch light, the paper flapping in the evening breeze, and I felt a knot tightening in my chest. It wasn't fear, though. It was anger. Pure, steady anger that someone thought they could march into my life, into my home and tell me to destroy something that mattered to me just because they didn't like the way it looked. I crumpled the notice in my hand and tossed it onto the porch. Enough was enough. The next morning, Karen came by again, this time with 2 members of the HOA board trailing behind her like bodyguards. They all stood at the edge of my driveway looking smug, as if they had caught me committing a crime. Karen raised her voice loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "This is your final warning," she declared, jabbing a finger toward the trees. "If you don't cut them down, the HOA will fine you into bankruptcy. You think you can ignore us? You can't. We have the power here." Her words echoed across the street, drawing a small crowd of curious onlookers. I stayed calm, leaning against the porch railing, letting her rant. The more she talked, the clearer it became to everyone watching that this wasn't about rules or safety. It was about ego. She wanted to break me, to make an example out of me, to prove she was untouchable. But deep down I knew something she didn't, and that knowledge kept me steady while she shouted. I could feel the tension in the air, the way neighbors shifted uncomfortably, some looking at me with pity, others at her with growing irritation. I didn't argue with her that day. I just told her I understood her position and that I would take it under advisement. Her smile widened, smug and satisfied, as if she believed she had won. She didn't realize I was simply giving her enough rope to hang herself. As she turned and marched off with her little entourage, I felt the weight of what was coming settle in. This wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning, and while she thought she was building a case against me, what she was really doing was setting herself up for a fall she'd never see coming. Over the next couple of weeks, things went from frustrating to downright ridiculous, and it became clear that Karen wasn't going to let this go without turning it into the biggest spectacle the neighborhood had ever seen. The letters kept coming, each one thicker than the last, filled with pages of so-called violations and new threats of fines. It seemed like every time I opened my mailbox, there was another envelope with the HOA seal stamped across it like a warning label, and each one was worded harsher, almost gleeful, as though they enjoyed turning the screws. I stopped being surprised and just started stacking them in a neat pile on my kitchen table, a paper tower that grew taller with every passing day, a physical reminder of the nonsense I was dealing with. But Karen wasn't content with just burying me in paper. She had to make it personal. She began showing up unannounced, marching up my driveway as if it were her property, pointing at the trees, snapping photos with her phone, and scribbling in her ever-present clipboard. Once I caught her trying to measure the distance from the branches to the road with a tape measure, muttering under her breath like she was preparing a case for trial. The audacity of it all was almost comical, but the constant intrusion started to wear thin, especially when I realized she was dragging the whole neighborhood into her crusade. Rumors began swirling, carried on the quiet conversations neighbors had over fences or whispered at block parties. Some people believed her story, that my trees were dangerous, that I was being stubborn, that I thought I was above the rules. Others saw it for what it was, Karen flexing her control and turning a minor issue into a neighborhood war. I could feel the division growing every time I walked outside. Some neighbors would wave, offering sympathetic smiles, while others would glance away quickly, avoiding eye contact as though being seen talking to me might earn them a target on their back. One afternoon I was watering the flowers near my porch when Mrs. Peterson from across the street shuffled over, her voice low like she was sharing a secret. "I think it's ridiculous what she's doing," she whispered, glancing around nervously. "Those trees have been here forever, and they've never hurt anyone. Don't let her push you around." It was nice to hear, but the fact that she felt the need to whisper showed just how much fear Karen had managed to instill in people. Another neighbor, on the other hand, confronted me outright, telling me I should just play ball and cut the trees before the HOA made life unbearable for everyone else. That stung, not because I cared what he thought, but because it showed how far Karen's narrative had spread, that my resistance was somehow a threat to the community, when in reality, it was her stubbornness that was causing all the chaos. The tension boiled over when Karen decided to call a special HOA meeting, one that she made sure everyone in the neighborhood knew about. Flyers were taped to mailboxes, emails were sent out, and even a sign was planted near the entrance of the subdivision. Emergency HOA meeting, safety concerns. I didn't plan on going at first, Honestly, I didn't feel like wasting an evening listening to her rant in front of a room full of neighbors. But when several people urged me to show up, some supportive, others just curious to see if I'd actually defend myself, I realized that not showing up would only fuel her narrative further. So I went, and it was exactly what I expected. Karen stood at the front of the community center, in a bright red suit that practically screamed for attention, a stack of papers in her hand, and a smug smile plastered on her face. Behind her, a projector displayed blown-up photos of my trees, complete with red circles and arrows like some kind of courtroom evidence. She spoke with dramatic flair, warning everyone about the dangers of falling branches, the eyesore that disrupted the uniform appearance of the neighborhood, and the liability it created for the entire HOA. She even had charts showing potential costs if one of the trees were to fall, though anyone with common sense could see the numbers were exaggerated scare tactics. As she spoke, I looked around the room and saw neighbors shifting uncomfortably, some nodding along, others clearly skeptical. When she finally opened the floor for comments, I stood up, calm and steady, and said simply that the trees were healthy, that I had every right to keep them, and that cutting them down was unnecessary and destructive. I didn't mention my profession or my authority. I wasn't ready to play that card yet, but I made it clear that I wasn't going to be bullied into compliance. Karen's smile faltered for a second, but she quickly recovered, accusing me of being reckless and selfish, painting me as the villain who cared more about a few scraggly trees than the safety of the neighborhood. That meeting didn't resolve anything, but it exposed the cracks in her facade. People could see how far she was willing to go, how exaggerated her claims had become, and while some were too afraid to say it out loud, I could tell they were starting to doubt her. Still, that didn't slow her down. If anything, it fueled her fire. Within days, I got another notice, this time not just threatening fines, but hinting at legal action. She even suggested the HOA might step in and hire a company to cut the trees themselves, then bill me for the costs. That was the moment I realized she wasn't going to stop, until she either got her way or was forced to back down. The problem for her was that she had no idea who she was really dealing with, and the more she pushed, the closer she got to finding out. But for now, I kept my calm. I let her pile on the threats, let her rally her little army, let her puff herself up in front of anyone who would listen, because I knew the day was coming when I'd pull back the curtain and reveal the truth, and when that day arrived, the look on her face would be worth every ounce of patience I was burning through. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning, one of those bright, clear days when the whole neighborhood seemed to come alive with the sound of lawnmowers, kids riding bikes and dogs barking in the distance. The kind of day that should have been peaceful, but instead turned into the moment everything boiled over. I was drinking coffee on the porch, enjoying the view of the sun spilling through the branches of the very trees Karen despised, when I heard the sound of engines rumbling down the street. At first I thought it was just the usual landscapers, or maybe a delivery truck, but when I looked up my jaw clenched. 2 large trucks with chainsaws, ladders and a wood chipper in tow rolled right up in front of my property, their doors stamped with the logo of a local tree service. Behind them, like a conductor leading an orchestra, was Karen in her bright yellow suit this time, waving her clipboard like a badge of authority. She didn't even hesitate. She walked straight up to the workers and began pointing at my trees, loudly explaining that they were here to take care of a dangerous situation. The workers looked hesitant, glancing from her to me, clearly unsure if she had the authority to give them those orders, but Karen was nothing if not convincing when she wanted to be. She puffed herself up and started talking about HOA codes, safety violations, and community liability, words she knew would scare people into compliance. By the time I stepped off my porch and started walking toward them, a crowd of neighbors had already begun gathering on the sidewalks, drawn by the noise and the sight of the trucks. Karen, of course, thrived on the attention, turning to the growing audience and declaring that she was finally putting an end to my so-called recklessness. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, not from fear but from the sheer gall of what she was attempting, trying to cut down my trees without my consent, on my property, using community funds no less. I raised my voice just enough to cut through the chatter and told the workers in no uncertain terms that they were not to touch a single branch. Karen immediately spun on her heel, her face tight with irritation, and snapped, You don't get a say in this anymore. The HOA voted, and this is happening." Her words carried a smug finality as if she had already won, but I could see the cracks in her confidence. The workers froze, caught between a woman barking orders with a clipboard and the actual homeowner standing firm in front of them. That standoff dragged on for a moment, until Karen, realizing she was losing her grip, pulled out her phone and announced loudly that she was calling the police. The crowd gasped a little at that, some neighbors shaking their heads, others whispering under their breath. She made the call right there on speakerphone, painting me as an uncooperative and aggressive homeowner who was defying HOA mandates and threatening safety. I just stood there, calm, arms crossed, letting her dig the hole deeper. When the police finally arrived, sirens echoing down the street, the crowd grew even larger. Kids tugging at their parents to see what was happening, adults clutching their phones to record every moment. Karen rushed to the officers like a star witness in a courtroom, gesturing wildly at the trees, at me, at the trucks, explaining how she was just trying to protect the neighborhood. Her voice dripped with self-righteousness. But when she finished, the officer turned to me and asked for my side of the story. I looked him in the eye and simply said, "This is my property. These are my trees. No one has the right to cut them without my consent." The officer frowned, clearly unimpressed with Karen's theatrics, and asked if I had documentation proving ownership and rights over the property. I smiled because this was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment to let just a little more truth slip through, without revealing the full picture yet. I told him calmly that not only did I own the property, but I had professional expertise in forestry, and I assured him the trees posed no danger whatsoever. Karen's face flushed a deep red as murmurs rippled through the crowd. She tried to interrupt, insisting I was lying, that I was just making excuses to avoid compliance, but the officer silenced her with a raised hand. He asked if the HOA had legal documentation, granting them authority to order private contractors onto my land. Karen hesitated, fumbling with her clipboard, shuffling papers that had no real weight behind them. The silence stretched long enough that even her most loyal supporters in the crowd began shifting uncomfortably, realizing this might not be the open and shut case she had promised. The officer finally told the workers they had no grounds to proceed without proper legal authority, and suggested they pack up their equipment until the matter was resolved. Karen sputtered, her voice climbing higher as she argued. But the workers weren't about to risk a trespassing charge, so they began rolling up their chainsaws and heading back to their trucks. The sight of her grand victory crumbling in front of the entire neighborhood was almost poetic. Still, she wasn't ready to give up, not yet. She turned to the crowd, pointing at me, her voice shrill and desperate, declaring that I was putting everyone's safety at risk and that she would take this to the highest level if she had to. Some neighbors clapped politely for her effort, but many others shook their heads, their patience thinning after watching her spectacle drag on for so long. The police gave me a nod, advised me to document everything, and left without issuing a single citation. As the trucks rumbled away and the crowd slowly dispersed, I caught Karen glaring at me with a mix of fury and disbelief, as though she couldn't comprehend how her carefully staged show had backfired so completely. And yet, even as she stormed off, I knew in my gut that she wasn't done. People like her never admit defeat easily. She would regroup, plot again, and come back even harder. What she didn't realize was that every step she took only brought her closer to the truth she was desperate to avoid. The truth about who I really was and the authority I carried, not just as a homeowner, but as someone with far more power over the land than she could ever imagine. The fallout from that chaotic Saturday lingered in the air like smoke after a bonfire. And though the police had left and the contractors were gone, I could feel the tension hanging heavier than ever. For the next few days, I noticed neighbors whispering in driveways, pausing their conversations whenever I walked past, eyes darting between me and the tall green canopy above my property. Karen wasn't lying low either. If anything, she doubled her efforts. I caught her walking door to door with her clipboard, knocking on houses, gathering signatures for some petition, no doubt spinning her story about the dangerous trees and the reckless homeowner who refused to listen. I didn't confront her, not yet, because timing was everything, and I knew the next move would come from her side. Sure enough, less than a week later, I received an official-looking letter from the HOA, thicker than the usual ones, with bold lettering across the top. Final notice before legal action. Inside it was the same bluster, but this time they attached invoices from the tree company, as if preparing to bill me for work that never even happened. It was laughable, but it also gave me exactly the opening I needed. They wanted to play legally? Fine. Now it was my turn to bring out the truth. So when the HOA announced yet another urgent meeting to discuss unresolved issues, I decided that was the moment I'd stop holding back. This time I didn't just walk in as a frustrated homeowner. I walked in ready to end the charade once and for all. The meeting room was packed, more than I'd ever seen, with neighbors crowding into folding chairs and standing along the walls. Everyone was buzzing with anticipation, like they knew something big was about to happen. Karen, of course, was at the front, wearing another one of her flashy suits, this one a deep green that almost seemed like a mockery of the very trees she was trying to erase. She had her stack of papers, her projector ready, and that smug smile glued to her face like she was the star of her own courtroom drama. She wasted no time, launching into her performance, listing every supposed violation, waving documents in the air, declaring that the HOA had no choice but to escalate matters to protect the community. She even tried to guilt the room by pointing out how much time and money she had already spent fighting this battle. When she finally paused for breath, I stood up slowly, calm as ever, and all eyes turned to me. For a moment the room was silent, except for the faint hum of the projector fan. Then I spoke, not angrily, not defensively, but firmly, letting my words carry to every corner of the room. I explained that while I had respected the HOA's right to maintain certain standards, there was a line they had crossed, trespassing onto private property, hiring contractors without consent, and attempting to enforce rules they had no legal authority to back up. Karen tried to cut me off, but I raised my hand and kept going, my voice steady. And then, when I had the full attention of everyone in the room, I revealed the part I had been holding back since the very beginning. For those of you who don't know, I said, I'm not just the homeowner here. I'm the county forester. A ripple moved through the room, gasps, murmurs, people leaning forward as if they hadn't heard me right. I let the weight of it sink in before continuing, explaining that my job wasn't just about knowing trees, but about protecting them, maintaining ecological balance, and making decisions that kept the county safe while preserving the natural landscape. I pulled out documents of my own, not flimsy notices or exaggerated charts, but official county reports, assessments, and certifications proving the health and safety of the trees Karen had been demonizing for months. I explained how each one had been evaluated, how none posed any threat, and how, in fact, cutting them down would harm the environment, disrupt the soil stability, and even increase risks during storms by removing natural windbreaks. By the time I finished, the room was silent, the weight of the revelation pressing down like a heavy blanket. Karen's face was priceless. Her mouth opened and closed like she wanted to argue but couldn't find a single word. She tried to laugh it off, to say I was making it up, but when I handed the officer from last week's standoff a copy of my county credentials and watched him nod in confirmation, her denial crumbled. The crowd wasn't on her side anymore. Neighbors who had once whispered in uncertainty now looked at her with narrowed eyes, some even shaking their heads in disgust at how far she had dragged them into her personal crusade. A man in the back muttered loudly, "So all this was for nothing?" And suddenly the room buzzed with frustration. Not at me, but at her. People began asking questions. Why had she wasted everyone's time? Why had she lied about safety risks? Why had she spent HOA funds on something she had no authority to order? Karen's composure faltered completely as she stammered about just doing her duty and keeping people safe, but no one was buying it anymore. The more she spoke, the more isolated she became. And I just stood there, not gloating, not shouting, just calmly reminding everyone that I had been patient, that I hadn't wanted a fight, but that I couldn't let misinformation and power trips endanger the very environment I was sworn to protect. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Karen had tried to frame me as reckless, yet it turned out I was the expert whose entire career revolved around stewardship and safety. By the time the meeting ended, the vote wasn't about my trees anymore. It was about whether Karen should even remain in her position. The majority demanded her resignation, their voices rising in frustration, and though the board tried to quiet the uproar, It was clear her days of unchecked authority were numbered. Karen stormed out before the vote could even be taken, her heels clicking angrily across the floor. Her clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. And as the room slowly emptied, neighbors came up to me one by one, some apologizing for doubting me, others simply thanking me for standing up and revealing the truth. The battle wasn't completely over. People like Karen don't just vanish overnight, but for the first time in months the balance of power had shifted and everyone could see it. What she had meant as a final victory had instead exposed her lies and put me in a position stronger than ever. Still, I knew Karen well enough by now to realize she wouldn't accept humiliation quietly, and as much as the crowd's support felt like a win, I could feel in my gut that she was already plotting her next desperate move, one that might be even more reckless than anything she had tried before. If the story had ended at that meeting, with the truth revealed and the neighborhood finally on my side, it might have been a neat conclusion. But Karen wasn't the type to fade quietly into the background, and instead of accepting her defeat, she chose to double down in the most reckless way possible. Within days, rumors started spreading that she was going above the HOA, filing complaints with the county and state, telling anyone who would listen that I had fabricated my credentials, that I was abusing my so-called authority, and that the trees on my property were a ticking time bomb waiting to destroy the community. She began emailing residents long rants filled with half-truths and wild accusations, each one more desperate than the last, even claiming that I had political connections I was using to bully her into silence. People rolled their eyes at first, but when I learned she had actually tried to file a fraudulent complaint with the county environmental office, claiming I had allowed diseased trees to spread into public land, I knew she had officially crossed from annoying to dangerous. The problem for her was that filing a false report with government agencies isn't just frowned upon, it's illegal. When investigators reached out to me, it took only minutes for me to provide my records, photographs, and inspection notes, all neatly documented as part of my job, and it was clear who was telling the truth. Karen, on the other hand, had no evidence, just her usual exaggerated claims, and when pressed for proof, she grew evasive and combative, insisting that her authority as HOA president should have been enough. That arrogance backfired spectacularly. Not only did the county dismiss her complaint outright, but they also launched a review into her misuse of HOA resources. Apparently, several residents had quietly reported her for spending association funds without approval, hiring contractors without votes, and funneling money into pet projects designed more to boost her ego than help the community. Suddenly, she wasn't just fighting me, she was fighting to keep herself out of serious legal trouble. But Karen wasn't finished yet. One morning, I woke to the sound of voices outside and stepped onto my porch to find her standing on the sidewalk with a small group of loyal followers, waving signs like it was some sort of protest. Save the neighborhood. One sign read, while another had a crude drawing of a tree falling onto a house. They chanted about safety and accountability, but most of the neighborhood didn't join in. In fact, many stood at a distance, recording the circus on their phones, shaking their heads in disbelief. I didn't engage, not directly, because I knew that's what she wanted. Instead, I documented everything, every sign, every chant, every false claim she shouted at passing cars. The final straw came when she trespassed again, leading her little parade right up to my driveway and screaming about public hazard while trying to shove one of her flyers into my mailbox. That was the moment I called the police myself, not out of anger, but because enough was enough. When the officers arrived, Karen tried to spin the situation like she always did, claiming she was exercising her rights, that she was enforcing safety codes, but this time the officers weren't buying it. They had already seen her antics once before, and now, with a paper trail of false reports and harassment, they had grounds to act. Watching her argue with the officers was like watching a balloon slowly deflate. Her voice went from commanding to shrill to pitiful as they explained that trespassing, harassment and filing false complaints were criminal offenses. She was warned before, but now they weren't interested in warnings anymore. By the end of that encounter, Karen was escorted away, still sputtering about injustice, while her followers scattered, embarrassed to be associated with the mess. News of her arrest spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, And suddenly the whispers weren't about me or my trees anymore. They were about her. About how far she had fallen, how all the power she clung to had slipped right through her fingers. The HOA board held an emergency session not long after, and though I wasn't present, I didn't need to be. By the end of the night, she had been officially removed from her position, stripped of her authority and banned from using HOA funds for anything without approval. Neighbors who had once avoided me now stopped by with handshakes, baked goods, even simple words of thanks, relieved that the drama was finally ending. Still, I couldn't help but feel a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion. Months of tension had finally reached their breaking point, and though I had stood my ground and revealed the truth, it had taken every ounce of patience and restraint to avoid escalating sooner. What struck me most was how quickly power can corrupt someone, how a simple position on a homeowner's board had given Karen the illusion she could control not just rules about lawns and mailboxes, but the land itself, the trees that had stood long before any of us moved in. Her downfall wasn't just about me. It was about the whole community realizing that leadership without accountability is dangerous. That fear and intimidation can only hold people in line for so long before reality comes crashing down. As for me, I returned to my porch, coffee in hand, watching the sun filter through the branches of the trees that had sparked the entire battle. They stood tall, unbothered, living proof that patience and truth outlast noise and lies. But even in that calm, I couldn't shake the sense that the story wasn't entirely over yet, that there were still conversations to be had, lessons to be learned, and reflections about what it really meant to stand up, not just for yourself but for what's right, even when the cost is months of chaos. And it was in those quiet moments, sipping my coffee and watching the leaves stir in the breeze, that I began to piece together what all of this had really meant for me, my neighbors, and maybe even Karen herself. When the dust finally settled and the chaos of Karen's crusade was behind us, the neighborhood seemed to exhale in unison, like everyone had been holding their breath for months and could finally relax again. And for the first time in a long time, the street felt like a community instead of a battlefield. The constant tension that had hung in the air was gone, replaced by the simple rhythms of everyday life. Kids laughing as they rode their bikes, families barbecuing on their driveways, people waving to each other without the shadow of Karen's drama looming overhead. My porch became something of a gathering spot, not because I invited it, but because neighbors who had once kept their distance now felt comfortable stopping by to chat, sometimes bringing coffee, sometimes just curiosity, eager to hear more about what had really happened and how I had managed to stay so calm through it all. I never bragged, never rubbed it in, because deep down I knew this wasn't about me versus Karen. It was about a lesson for everyone, about standing up against unfair authority without losing your sense of patience or decency. More than once, someone told me they admired how I hadn't lashed out or tried to escalate things, how I had waited until the right moment to reveal the truth, and while I appreciated their words, I told them the truth was simpler than that. When you know you're standing on solid ground, you don't have to yell, you just have to stand firm and let the truth carry its own weight. Even Karen, though she was no longer a presence at board meetings or parading around with her clipboard, lingered in conversations, not as the powerful figure she once tried to be, but as a cautionary tale of what happens when control turns into obsession. People speculated about whether she'd move away or just keep her head down. But to me, it didn't matter. Her power was gone, and the community had learned to see through the noise she created. The HOA, perhaps humbled by how close they had come to a legal disaster, began operating differently, holding open meetings, actually listening to residents, and making decisions with transparency instead of letting one voice dominate. Oddly, Karen's downfall had forced the entire board to reset, to rebuild trust with the very people they were supposed to serve. And while I never intended to play the role of a reformer, it felt good to know that something positive had grown out of months of turmoil. For me personally, the biggest change wasn't in the HOA or even in the way neighbors saw me. It was in the quiet sense of peace I felt every time I walked my property and looked up at those towering trees. They hadn't just stood through storms and seasons. They had stood through conflict, through threats, through chainsaws parked at their roots, and now they swayed gently in the breeze, still here because I refused to give in. It reminded me that sometimes the things worth protecting aren't just about property lines or ownership. They're about preserving something bigger, something rooted in the land itself, something that outlasts our petty disputes. And yet I also couldn't help but reflect on Karen herself. As much as her actions had been outrageous, as much as she had tried to tear me down, I found myself wondering what made her cling so hard to control, why she needed to win so badly that she was willing to risk her reputation and even break the law. Perhaps it was pride, perhaps it was fear, or perhaps it was the simple truth that some people can't handle even a small taste of authority without letting it consume them. I didn't hate her, not really. I pitied her because in trying so hard to control everyone else, she had lost control of herself. And as much as I was glad she no longer had the power to torment me or my neighbors, I hoped that somewhere in the fallout, she would see the truth and learn from it. Life in the valley returned to its slow, steady rhythm, the way it had always been meant to be. And with every sunrise spilling light across the hills and every quiet evening, where the wind rustled through the branches, I felt more connected to the land than ever. It was funny, really, how something as small as an HOA dispute had turned into a test of character, of patience, of truth. But that's how life works sometimes. The battles we don't choose still find us. And the way we respond writes the story people remember. And if there was one thing I carried with me after it all, it was this. Never underestimate the strength of quiet persistence, because when you stay grounded in what's right, even the loudest storms eventually pass. Karen had thought she could force me into submission, but in the end, it wasn't my anger or my defiance that ended her reign. It was the steady truth, revealed at the right time, that crumbled her empire of bluster. And as I sat back on my porch one last time, coffee in hand, watching the sun dip low behind the trees she had once sworn to destroy, I couldn't help but smile at the irony that those same trees, the ones she claimed were a danger, had become the symbol of everything she couldn't shake. Resilience, patience, and the simple fact that some things are meant to stand tall, no matter how hard someone tries to cut them down. Looking back now, it's almost surreal to think how something as small as a neighborhood dispute could spiral into months of conflict, stress and showdowns, and yet leave behind lessons that I know I'll carry for the rest of my life. Because when you're in the middle of a storm like that, you don't realize how much it's shaping you until the calm finally returns. The HOA battle with Karen began with her demanding compliance with rules that were never intended to apply to me, and it ended with her unraveling in front of everyone, her credibility destroyed not by anger or retaliation, but by the simple weight of truth that couldn't be denied. And through all of it, I learned that patience isn't weakness, that restraint isn't surrender, and that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is to wait until the right moment to act. Because when you move too quickly, when you lash out in frustration, you give people like Karen exactly what they want, fuel for their fire, proof for their accusations. But when you stay calm, when you let them talk themselves into corners, the truth comes out sharper than any words you could throw. That was the real victory, not in embarrassing her or winning some technical argument, but in showing that control based on fear and intimidation can't last forever, not when people finally see it for what it is. And I think that's why my neighbors changed too, why the board shifted its ways. Because once the illusion of Karen's authority was gone, people remembered that communities are supposed to be about connection, not control. Still, I can't help but wonder sometimes how close it came to breaking me, because there were nights when I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying her threats in my head, imagining worst-case scenarios, doubting whether standing my ground was even worth it. But every time I stepped outside and felt the breeze in the trees, every time I saw those roots dug deep in the soil, I knew I couldn't just roll over, because if I gave in once, there would be no stopping the next demand, and the one after that. So I guess the biggest lesson wasn't just about Karen or the HOA, it was about life itself, about the importance of protecting what matters to you, no matter how small it might seem to others, because if it matters to you, then it's worth the fight. And maybe that's why I share this story now, because I know there are people out there dealing with their own Karens, whether it's a boss, a neighbor, or someone in their family, someone who thrives on pushing boundaries and making others feel powerless. If you're one of them, I want you to know this. You're not powerless, not as long as you stand firm in what's true. The storm may rage, the noise may feel overwhelming, but if you hold your ground, the truth will eventually cut through. Because the louder someone has to shout to maintain control, the closer they are to losing it. And though Karen's story ended with her stumbling under the weight of her own lies, yours doesn't have to get that far. Learn from mine. Don't feed the fire, don't fight on their level, just wait, stay calm, stay grounded, and let the truth do its work. Because one day, just like me, you'll look back and smile at the irony of it all, at how the thing that once felt like it could break you became the very thing that made you stronger. And who knows, maybe your story will be the next one we tell. Because if there's anything I've learned, it's that these battles aren't rare. They're happening in neighborhoods, workplaces, and families everywhere. Stories of people who refuse to be silenced, who choose courage over compliance. So stick around, because next time I'll share another tale that proves just how far some people will go to control others, and how the smallest act of resistance can change everything.